Thank you. I think my colleagues have asked all their questions on our side, so we're going to do a second round of questions. And forgive me if I am repeating ground that they have covered. Let me ask you, Ms. Valente, is there anything in this bill that takes guns away from women?
There is not unless the woman has been adjudicated by a court as either a misdemeanant, a felon, or someone subject to a protection order.
So a woman who buys a gun for self-defense, who is law-abiding and not threatening domestic abuse in a way that a court would adjudicate a real and present threat, would have no fear of losing a firearm, correct?
That is correct. And we do hear from women who would like to arm themselves. Our recommendation at the National Coalition Against Domestic Violence is that studies do show that it is, as you quoted earlier, the mere presence of a firearm in the house poses a danger. It doesn't matter who owns the firearm. During a domestic abuse incident, research shows that the abuser is quite likely to take control of the firearm and so then put the survivor at risk. So those who want to do that, though, because they are familiar with firearms and do wish to use firearms, we recommend highly that they get training constantly. We know that law enforcement trains every month with their firearms, yet we know that different national organizations that study police activity have told us that only 40% of gunfire that law enforcement officers fire actually reaches the intended place. So we know that even if you're practicing every month, something bad could happen otherwise. We believe that the best thing is for all firearms to be out of the house until the courts and the law have dealt with the domestic violence.
And that's your recommendation based on prudent and wise practices, but a woman who disagrees with you, or a man for that matter, threatened with domestic violence could buy a firearm under this law. Nothing would preclude it.
Nothing would preclude it.
There was a mention of the Grassley-Cruz proposal, and just to tell you a little bit about it, and then I'll ask you a couple of questions. The Grassley-Cruz proposal creates a number of new federal offenses for trafficking in straw purchases, but it would only prohibit straw purchases if prosecutors can prove the purchaser knew that the recipient was prohibited from buying a gun or knew that the person intended the gun for a crime. Pretty difficult to know. It would only prohibit trafficking if the prosecutors could prove that the trafficker knew that the recipient of the firearm was prohibited. This proposal actually weakens the law, as you can tell from your knowledge of the current law, because it imposes heightened knowledge requirements that are more difficult for prosecutors to meet and eliminates the ability of prosecutors to go after those who lie on federal firearms about their intent to purchase firearms for another person. There are actually stronger bipartisan proposals, like the Leahy-Collins-Durbin Stop the Illegal Trafficking in Firearms Act, that would help address these problems. The Grassley-Cruz proposal also makes it harder for ATF to do its job and easier for dealers to sell handguns across state line. It imposes constraints on ATF enforcement. It actually erases from the NICS background check system the names of individuals determined to be mentally incompetent following an administrative proceeding when the VA submits that information to the government authorities. These measures undermining enforcement seem to really weaken the law because enforcement is so important. All the great laws on the books are dead letter if they're not consistently, conscientiously, and competently enforced. Would you agree?
Absolutely. And I think that that's one of the wonderful things about this bill, the grant program within it, which would absolutely address that need for improving enforcement. And we're very, very happy to see that in there.
In fact, far from, as my colleague from Texas suggests, defunding law enforcement, this bill actually bolsters law enforcement with more resources, correct?
It would, based on the community-based response, which would involve law enforcement, courts, victim advocates, probation, parole. All of those are important pieces in putting together a strong enforcement response. But law enforcement, of course, is key to that.
I'm going to ask one more question, then turn to my colleague, Senator Klobuchar, for her statement and questions. She's going to join us remotely. But let me ask you, Ms. Mason, in your opinion, would this kind of law bolster your trust in the system if you were in your sister's place years ago? And has the Connecticut law, in your view, added public safety to survivors and victims of domestic violence?
I think it would have, definitely made my sister feel more comfortable. I mean, she went to the police. She told them how much she feared for her safety. We just weren't sure what he was capable of. But I think that having this would have been another layer of protection for her and, maybe more of peace of mind that there was something more behind this than just that temporary restraining order, that, he couldn't go and purchase another weapon, that he couldn't keep the ones he did have. So it definitely, I think, adds another layer that we need.
Thank you. I don't know whether...
I'm here.